We haven't really talked about symbolism, but going back to 2020, it seems unmistakable. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't try and address why there has been, at this particular moment, a focus on, by protesters on statues and monuments, many of which have been the subject of discussion, either for preservation or the ire of others who wish these statues to go down or be relocated or shattered for years. But for some reason, this particular year, and I just think of a few things. One, in Richmond, in terms of the Robert E. Lee statue, especially after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, holograms not, being put on top of Robert E. Lee. So not merely the taking down, but keeping that Confederate, the so-called lost cause logic, right, of monuments on the one hand. Second example, and Michael, you mentioned this in terms of South Africa, but also not just the fees must fall, but the roads must fall movement. I mean, there's this sense of the connection of the figure of Cecil Rhodes as this imperialist who still is nonetheless central in the Rhodes Scholarship, right? But also in terms of the naming of an important university in South Africa. But thirdly, I'm really struck in the British context. There's so much emphasis on London, but Bristol was really one of the biggest areas where you have this figure, right? The brilliant University of Bristol, but nonetheless, the university, the city of Bristol, this massive urban space that many of the iconography is after a single figure who was so intimately tied to the slave trade and the funding of the slave ships that would then be central to the Middle Passage. So pointedly, why this moment? Has there been an attention to monuments and statues, particularly even those that had been the subject of heated debates for decades, quite frankly, and in some cases more? Why not? I mean, because that does seem to be also particularity.
Statues symbolize a particular period in the historical timeline, right? Take, for example, the statue of Cecil John Rhodes in South Africa. Cecil John Rhodes was central, to some of the atrocities that have occurred in Southern Africa. You talk of Zimbabwe, you can talk of Mozambique. There is some connection that it has. And so the Cecil John Rhodes statues represent a terrible epoch in the history of South Africa. And so when you take racism and statues together, there was a universal rejection of what Cecil John Rhodes stood for. And that was plunder, that was, in some cases, mass rape in some of these countries. And so the struggle for liberation could not allow symbols of the past to continue to exist while you are trying to create a new order, right? Well, the advantage we had in South Africa, to be sure, was that we said, look, statues form an important part of our history, right? And that the debate should be around how do we caution future generations never to go back to what Cecil John Rhodes and the others represented in our history. And so we didn't opt for destruction of monuments in South Africa. Instead, we had a national debate, which is still ongoing, as to how do we, preserve those monuments, but also teach that South Africans and the generation of South Africans to come should never go back there, because that would symbolize a backward, reversal of the most important gains that this country has made, in the last 20, 30 years. And so just finally, I was listening to an interesting discussion around the monuments, in the former Soviet Union. I was a student at CEU at the time. And I found it fascinating that what they decided to do in those countries was to rather create a statues park where you can go and you can reflect on some of the historical experiences that the former Soviet Union had gone through. And for me, that was important because, as policymakers, you can either decide to destroy history in whichever form it presents itself, or you can decide to correct that kind of history, but warn those that will come after you that we should never go back there. So that's broadly, how we dealt with monuments, Neil. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the question of why symbols have become such a powerful place of activism right now is one. I want to say, I think, my view is that symbols and have always been an important part of these mobilizations, right? People, as you were saying, some of these debates around statues are really long debates, but I think there are I think one of the things that people are using the statues or politics around the statues to do now is to call attention to the normalization of particular histories, right? Like and they're tied to the kinds of demands that people are making politically, right? People's demands now, I think, in a different kind of way, really call attention to what Du Bois would call the presence of the past, right? That actually the past, we didn't leave the past behind, but the past lives on with us in all these various legacies of racial inequality. I think the statues, in some ways, we walk by these statues every day. They're kind of normalized parts of our life. We don't even think about them sometimes, right? And there's this way in which by just toppling the statue or defacing the statue, I think protesters are drawing attention to how that presence how that past remains present, and how a particular one way of understanding the past is being a kind of normalized and institutionalized in our everyday practices. So my view is that it's become a really important site in some ways because the forms of demands that we have now, especially around reparations, are ones that are intimately tied to how we adjudicate the legacy of the past, how we come to terms with our various histories of racial and colonial domination. So it's been fascinating to me to see not just that the statues are the sites of politics and protests, but also the various ways that people engage with them. So I found it, for instance, very striking. In the Bristol case, Colston's statue was thrown into the sea, This is the sea in which many Africans lost their lives in the Middle Passage, right? Or in Belgium, that King Leopold statue was, that a flag of the Congo was placed onto the King Leopold statue, right? Congo being his personal colony for a period of time at the turn of the 20th century. So I think there's this, it's not just that people are very strategic about the forms of politics that they're engaged in. I think this connects a little bit to your point about tactics, that, people have innovated in terms of the struggles that they're interested in or intervening in now are legacies of older struggles, but they're not the exact same struggles. So I think we see a certain kind of innovation that opens up new kinds of questions for our moment that weren't on the table in an earlier moment.